Hey guys, I would just like to start this video by thanking everyone for the support on my first video. At the time of my recording this, it sits at over 300 views with 20 likes, and I even have over 15 subscribers from just that one video. However, this video is going to be a bit different. My previous video was just me directly responding to another video by a right-wing figure, and I had several scripts prepared to do more responses to different videos, but I decided to put those off for the time being because before I go into them, I think it would be a good idea to do a video surrounding a particular phrase that tends to get thrown around a lot on the internet. And so I decided to make a video just addressing the concept of white privilege. Although this isn't a response video, we may be seeing some familiar faces in this one. I'm sure this video is going to be fairly controversial, since white privilege as a concept is pretty much always controversial.
I love my white male privilege. I love being made to feel collective white guilt for the slave trade.
Maybe it's okay to hate white people. After all, we have white privilege.
White privilege is a myth and a lie and should be completely destroyed. It's rooted in racism. It is a racist idea.
Wow, geez, you guys need to chill out a bit. You sound like you're starting to get a bit triggered there, like a bunch of snowflakes. But anyway, like I said, white privilege always seems to be a rather touchy subject, and both right-wingers and anti-SJWs who don't necessarily consider themselves right-wing tend to have pretty strong reactions against it. So I'd like to answer in this video whether or not white privilege exists. We should start by defining the term white privilege. Wikipedia defines it as the societal privilege that benefits people whom society identifies as white in some countries, beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. I think this definition is one that is pretty consistent with how a lot of people see it, and therefore I would like to address it. I think the first part of the definition, the societal privilege that benefits people whom society identifies as white in some countries, is pretty good. But I take an issue with the second part of the definition where it says, beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. The reason I say that is because it seems to exclude the possibility that white privilege itself could be a cause of those circumstances. For this reason, I will be turning to the definition from the online Cambridge Dictionary, which says, the fact of people with white skin having advantages in society that other people do not. Now, this also isn't a perfect definition, since it also leaves out the fact that some people who have white skin may not be deemed white by society based on various factors. However, I still think these two definitions, with their flaws pointed out, provide a pretty solid idea. Essentially, it is the idea that in certain societies, those whom society deems to be white have some sort of societal advantage to those who are not considered to be white, and for this video, I'm going to be specifically talking about my home country of the United States. So now for the question, does white privilege exist? Yes, but I'm not only going to say that it exists, but that you probably know it does as well, even if you've convinced yourself that you don't. I'm going to start by stating the following fact. Black people are, on average, poorer than white people. That fact is so well known and ingrained in our society that you fully agree with that, even without me putting up a citation. But here's a graph anyway to prove my point. So now you might ask, why are African Americans so much poorer on average than white Americans? One might answer by saying that's just the result of chance, but when there's such a strong trend, that's just not realistic. And while some people may say it, I don't buy that they actually believe that. There's really only two answers. It's either for social reasons, as in the effects that history and society have had on the black community, or the genetic argument, which would state that black people are just inherently inferior, and I may get some shit from alt-right people for saying this, but I happen to find the genetic argument to be quite racist, and I'm sure most normal conservatives would actually agree with that. Conservatives may try to give some other answers, such as that they just don't take personal responsibility, are more likely to commit crime, perform worse in school, have some sort of thug culture, etc. But the problem here is that all of these arguments just kick the can further down the road than actually, answering the question. That just leaves us asking why they don't practice personal responsibility, why they commit more crime, why they perform worse in school, or why they practice so-called thug culture. The only way to really answer those questions is to again apply the society versus genetics argument. I would like to encourage any conservative who may be watching to think about their reasons for why they think black people are poor on average, and then think why you think that reason came about. One conservative argument I hear in this case is that, yes, black people have a societal disadvantage holding them back, but it's the liberal Democrats causing it because they're the real racists. Now, if you want to see me debunking that idea, I already did in my previous video debunking Charlie Kirk's video debunking the party switch, the link to which will be in the description, so I suggest you go check that out if you're curious. However, for the sake of argument, let's pretend it's true that modern liberal Democrats are behind the oppression of black people. That means you are still acknowledging the fact that they face a societal disadvantage, even if you're wrong about what's causing that to be true. You believe in white privilege, you're just not calling it that. I would also like to raise another question to conservatives who acknowledge that black people face unfair treatment in society, which is why not support policies specifically in order to help them advance? Why not support affirmative action policies to help them? Why not support hate crime laws? Why not support allocating more funding to poor or working class urban areas inhabited by mostly black people? I happen to think this is incredibly immoral to see such injustices and then not do anything about it despite having the power to do so. Oh wait, that's right. If we did something to help them, that would be considered big government, which, as we all know, is always tyrannical. But anyway, the point here is that I genuinely believe that the vast majority of people, whether liberal or conservative, are at least on some level aware that white people have it better in our society than black people. And the vast majority of people know deep down that it is primarily due to social factors that make life harder for them. Although, to be fair to conservatives, one other explanation that a lot of conservatives use that arguably goes outside the social versus genetic dichotomy is leadership. Many conservatives will often make the argument that black leaders have led the black community astray. Again, I'm calling bullshit. Which do you think is more likely? Option A. Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, Louis Farrakhan, or whoever else somehow took the reins of the entire black community despite having no actual executive or legislative power other than acting as a cultural icon, and single-handedly led them to plunge black people into poverty just by, saying things. Or option B. The centuries of oppression black people have faced has put them in a disadvantaged socioeconomic status. How was the entire black community just supposedly magically fooled by a few people into ruining their entire lives? That seems kind of condescending there. And sure, Farrakhan and Sharpton have made some controversial statements, but what things did they say that somehow magically made black people poor? There's also plenty of amazing leaders doing great work in the black community, working to improve their neighborhoods and communities through various initiatives, whether it be helping children with their education, providing people with access to healthy food, teaching kids how to grow up with good character, and yes, even people trying to influence government policy to change society. But I'd like to quickly ask, why do you think the black community needs leaders in the first place? Why don't white people have white leaders specifically to help white people? The reason for that is because white people haven't faced persecution, discrimination, or other problems in society for their race. This again comes back to societal issues. So now that I've addressed the conservatives, this pretty much splits everything up into two camps. We have the majority of people who are subscribed to the social argument, and then you have the alt-right, which prefers the genetic argument. And to those people, I want to ask, what about Nigerian Americans? They come from the same parts of Western Africa as the ancestors of most African Americans, and they don't even have the same white admixture that most African Americans have, yet they have an even higher median household income than white Americans. And of course I know this is an argument based on anecdotal evidence, but what about African Americans who are intelligent and successful? Did those people just magically overcome genetic barriers, or is it far more likely that any barriers they had to overcome were social? Another alt-right argument I hear is that there were supposedly no sub-Saharan civilizations in Africa prior to colonialism. Now, this is historically inaccurate, and I may do a video on African civilizations some other time. And I also recommend you check out the YouTube channel channel From Nothing, which talks a lot about pre-colonial African civilizations, and I will be linking his channel in the description for you guys to check out. Granted, I will admit that the civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa were fewer in number and in some cases smaller in size, but in large part that's due to geography. The Sahara often isolated them from the massive connected chain of civilizations across Eurasia, and as a result they didn't benefit from the spread of technology across that chain. It's also way easier to start a civilization in the fertile, mild lands of places like Europe and Eastern Asia than in the disease-filled rainforests and savanna of Africa. While I've been primarily talking about the African American community, a lot of what I've been saying also applies to other minorities in this country that are less successful than white people, such as Latino Americans, Arab Americans, Pacific Islanders, and especially Native Americans, all of which have median household incomes less than not only white Americans, but the average American, although of course there are exceptions regarding certain ethnic groups within each of these racial categories, like the Nigerian Americans I mentioned before. However, a common argument against white privilege is that Asian Americans are successful and have a higher median household income than white Americans. While that is true, it doesn't really refute the fact that white privilege exists because white people still have a higher median household income than the average American. That being said, I will still address the claim that Asian people have privilege. A lot of people making this argument have a fundamental misunderstanding of how that came to be. Here to help me illustrate that point is everyone's favorite hack, Charlie Kirk.
Why don't they ever talk about Asian American privilege? Asian Americans were widely discriminated against in the 1940s and 50s. We treated them horribly and put them in internment camps. Then through a series of decades of making good choices, they've now become the richest per capita subracial group in America. I never hear about Asian American privilege. I never hear about people getting so upset that all the Asian Americans are getting the PhDs or the degrees or all the good jobs in California, yet they're trying to target white people.
Told you there'd be a familiar face. Anyway, an obvious issue here is the whole decision-making thing. Why is it that Asian Americans were all able to become such good decision-makers magically, even outperforming white people? Why is it that they were able to make such good decisions over the decades to lift them out of poverty, but say Black, Latino, Native Americans were not? If making good decisions to become rich is that easy, why could only the Asians do it? Again, that really seems to lend itself to the whole racist genetic argument, you know? The idea that one group is more capable simply due to who they are and not any sort of social factors they face, which is something I have already debunked with my Nigerian American example. Of course, I'm not surprised at all that Charlie Kirk would show some subtle racism after analyzing his argument against the party switch in my previous video, the link to which is in the description, by the way. Clearly, since this isn't a genetic thing, perhaps it's worth analyzing the social factors to see if there was any sort of change that caused Asian Americans to become more successful. As it turns out, the attitude towards Asian Americans in the US and the way they have been treated by our country has changed drastically over time. The first real waves of East Asian immigrants to the US came during the mid-19th century. Chinese immigrants came to seek wealth during the California Gold Rush and as workers to construct the Transcontinental Railroad. Many Japanese immigrants also came to the US following the Meiji Restoration in Japan in 1868. However, Asians at this time were poor. As Charlie said, they experienced serious racism. That racism manifested in various forms of discrimination. Not only were Japanese people thrown in camps during World War II, but in many cases, Asians were barred from both immigration and citizenship. Under the Naturalization Act of 1790, only free white persons were eligible to naturalize as American citizens, which prevented Asian immigrants from having many basic rights, such as the right to vote. In the Ozawa versus United States case of 1922 and United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind case in 1923, the Supreme Court upheld the racial qualification for citizenship and ruled that Asians were not white persons, although second-generation Asian Americans could become U.S. citizens due to birthright citizenship. The Page Act of 1875 barred the immigration of Chinese women into the U.S., and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited the immigration of all Chinese workers into the country. The U.S. again passed another law in 1924 setting strict quotas for Asian immigration. In 1907, the U.S. made the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan to sharply curtail Japanese immigration to the U.S. This and other acts curbing Asian immigration and Asian rights were of course the result of Yellow Peril, a racist view of Asian Americans as being an inferior, lazy, opium-addicted horde that is dangerous to our country. So what changed? When you look at this chart, you can see that Asians have been a tiny, barely existent minority for most of American history, and as already established, these Asian Americans were often poor and faced persecution. If you look at the trends on the chart, you see that the Asian American population really appears to boom in the mid-20th century. This isn't a coincidence. Many countries in Asia, such as China, favored the Soviet Union over the US, so the US government wanted to make their country and way of life seem more favorable to Asians. In 1952, the Walter McCarran Act nullified all federal anti-Asian exclusion laws and allowed for the naturalization of all Asians. Massive waves of Asian immigrants came to the US. However, the vast majority of immigrants who were able to make it to America under the new laws were those who were already successful. The US started a serious propaganda campaign to highlight Asian American success stories in order to show that they weren't racist. Then in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act amendments eliminated all racial and nationality-based discrimination in immigration quotas, allowing more and more already successful Asians into the United States. And by the way, remember those Nigerian Americans mentioned before? Yeah, that's also because the majority of Nigerians who came to America were already somewhat successful in Nigeria. This also goes for many other relatively wealthy immigrant communities. Asians have been used to propagate the myth of the model minority, a myth that many Americans have bought into, including many political hacks such as Charlie Kirk. So yes, it is true that social factors have led to Asians being more successful than average. However, to call this Asian privilege is dishonest, because the sample of Asians in the US largely consists of those who are already well educated and somewhat successful in Asia. And the only reason we as a society have focused so much on their success as a model minority is to improve our own image and as an excuse to blame other minorities for their own poverty, which is exactly what Charlie Kirk did in the clip that I just showed. Another common argument I hear a lot is white privilege is an excuse to divide people based on race and play identity politics, which is racist. The identity politics argument is one the right uses all the time, and it's pretty much the know you of political discourse. There's very little nuance to it, and conservatives tend to use it to mean whatever they want. But in this case, it's just being used by the right to smear people as racist for literally just calling out racism. The left isn't trying to divide anyone, they're just pointing out problems in our society so that we can work together and solve them. What's divisive is the people making up the lie that they're just saying these things because they hate white people. That's just not the case. Now, one final counter-argument I hear is, white privilege doesn't exist because there are white people who are poor. The thing is, white privilege isn't about specific individuals. It's about a general trend, namely that white people, on average, have societal advantages over non-whites that make them, on average, better off. If your issue is that you are poor or that you care about those who are poor, you should want to align yourself with those who are fighting poverty, not the people who are resisting social justice. If you can't afford to pay for college for either yourself or your kids, support programs to make higher education more accessible. If you aren't earning enough from your job or face harsh work conditions, fight for better wages, fight for regulations to ensure those better conditions, and fight for the right to form a union and strike to achieve these goals. If you can't afford medical treatment for yourself or your loved ones, fight for universal health care. And most importantly, if someone tells you the left wants to tax you and steal your hard-earned paycheck from you, don't buy into it, because chances are it's some billionaire-funded right-winger who wants to trick you into voting for tax cuts for the rich and leave you in the dust. Thanks for watching. Hopefully my next video shouldn't take as long. If you enjoyed that video, make sure to like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when I post a new video, follow me on Twitter, and make sure to leave a comment with any feedback or suggestions on what you would like me to review next.